Before the start of the season, it was hard to make any predictions regarding how the Grizzlies would perform. They were coming off a year in which they played like two different teams at times, and injuries and the lack of experience ultimately cost them a playoff spot. So probably it would have been the best to expect the same from them this time around, right? After all, their youth and the absence of one of their best players made it look like it would be difficult for them to win games consistently. And during the first few games of the season, it didn't seem like they would be capable of being competitive against the other teams. But then, things started to change. The team went on an impressive winning streak despite missing some of its key pieces. And now they're suddenly in a solid position to compete for a playoff spot for a second straight season. But despite their recent performances, there are still many questions to be answered. How should we treat their recent play? Is it sustainable? Are the Grizzlies a real playoff contender despite still being in the middle of a rebuild? Let's take a deeper look into each of these questions. First, we must start by remembering that last season was supposed to be the first in a rebuilding process. After a few years of steady decline, the Grizzlies realized their championship window had finally shut down and decided to start over again. They started by trading Marc Gasol and Mike Conley away, thus putting an end to the famous grit and grind era in Memphis. Then, after getting lucky in the lottery, they added a young and talented point guard in Ja Morant to pair him with Jaren Jackson Jr. That way, they managed to replace two of their cornerstones with players that, at the very least, seemed to have the potential to become building blocks of a new era. But little did we know, they were ready to compete right away. Jackson and Morant were surrounded by other young players like Brandon Clark, Tyus Jones, Dillon Brooks, and few veterans like Jonas Valanciunas. So considering their youth and the lack of chemistry between most of their players, the Grizzlies were expected to lose most of their games during last season. And for the first few months, there were little surprises other than Morant's play. However, as the calendar turned to 2020, the team suddenly started playing more cohesively and wins began to come around more often. After having an excellent run in January, they climbed to the 8th spot in the Western Conference and spent the rest of the season around the 500 mark. Against all odds, it started to look like they'd be able to make it to the playoffs in the first year of their rebuild, all thanks to excellent team culture and the leadership of Morant and Coach Jenkins. But unfortunately, the pandemic put an end to that dream. When the seeding game started inside the bubble, the Grizzlies failed to develop a rhythm and lost most of their games. On top of that, Jackson was lost for the season after suffering a torn meniscus in his left knee. Down one of their best players, and with the emergence of other teams in the West, it was hard for them to keep up the pace, and even though they managed to participate in the play-in tournament, the Trailblazers made sure to put a quick ending to their season. So, after exceeding all expectations, their season had a somewhat disappointing ending. And that's exactly what made it difficult to predict how they'd perform in the following year. After all, Jackson's injury would keep him out for at least a few months into the season, and it wasn't clear whether the Grizzlies would manage to remain competitive without him, especially considering how poorly they played inside the bubble. That way, the expectations came back to earth, and instead of being looked at as a playoff contender, the team was regarded once again as a developing project that would probably use the opportunity to help its young players improve. Of course, they didn't necessarily think the same way, but at least for the first couple of weeks, it looked like that would end up being the case. Memphis started the season with a disappointing 2-6 record, and to make matters worse, it didn't take long for injuries and coronavirus to make their presence felt on the team. First, Morant was forced to miss 8 games because of an ankle injury, and then, just a couple of games after making his return, the team had its next 5 games postponed because of health protocols. And once they were able to play again, some of their key players missed additional time, including Valanciunas and Grayson Allen. But not everything was bad news. Somehow the Grizzlies managed to go an even 4-4 with their starting point guard. And despite having 6 of their games postponed during 3 weeks, they started a winning streak that reached 7 games and included victories over quality teams like the Nets, 76ers, and the rival Spurs. That stretch pushed their record to 9-6, and they were suddenly in the middle of a playoff race in the West while also playing an exciting brand of basketball that focused on team play and ball movement. Of course, they've cooled off a little since that happened, and losses against the Pacers, Rockets, and Pelicans showed they still have a lot of learning to do. But there are multiple reasons to be excited about the team. One of those reasons, as we just mentioned, is their improved ball movement. Since the arrival of Jenkins, he's made it a point to teach his young players the value of sharing the ball and creating opportunities for one another. And while the results were encouraging during his first season with the team, they've been even better this time around. The Grizzlies are currently second in the league in assists per game and 7th in turnovers. When it comes to advanced stats, they're in the top 3 in assist percentage, assist-to-turnover ratio, and assist ratio. Not so long ago, they had a stretch of 4 consecutive road games where they posted at least 32 assists. It's also become usual for them to finish games with at least 5 or 6 players with double-digit scoring. In other words, they take pride in getting everyone involved, and the results are often positive. But even though their passing has been impressive, the truth is the Grizzlies haven't been spectacular on offense. Much like their previous versions, they've been a somewhat mediocre team when it comes to offensive rating. However, things are completely different when it comes to defense. After finishing last season as one of the middle teams in defensive rating, Memphis has made it to the top 10 by taking a few steps in the right direction. Unlike their grit and grind version, these Grizzlies are not as imposing close to the hoop. They don't have players as intimidating inside as Marc Gasol and Zach Randolph anymore. However, that hasn't stopped them from making life miserable for their opponents. They found their own way of doing things effectively, And now instead of relying on a physical presence to guard the paint, they focus on harassing opposing ball handlers in the perimeter. The results have been spectacular for them. They're currently leading the league in deflections per game while also being number 1 in steals. On top of that, their current average of 9.9 steals per game is on the verge of making history. If they can take that number to 10, they'd be the first team in the last 20 years to finish with such a high average, and only the third team to do so in league history. But their success on the defensive end hasn't been limited to the perimeter. Even though they no longer have a Defensive Player of the Year patrolling the paint, their big men are smart and athletic enough to disrupt plays down low. They're currently 11th in opponent points in the paint and 8th in contested two-point shots. They still have to do some work to become an elite team in that aspect, but they're capable of punishing rival teams when fully engaged. And that's something impressive in itself, especially considering they're playing without their best defensive big man while also relying on the duo of Valanciunas and rookie Xavier Tillman at the center position. But that's just a reflection of who they are. They've embraced the culture set by the players who came before them while also giving it their unique twist. They're proud about being the team that plays strong defense and shares the ball to win games. And even when they're not at full strength, they're not willing to make any excuses for their poor performances. But with that in mind, where should we place them in the pecking order in the Western Conference? Considering the way things have been going in the West, it's hard to tell where the Grizzlies may finish the season. They're talented enough to get wins at a healthy rate, and that's without even playing at full strength. Once Jackson and Justice Winslow are healthy enough to make their season debut, there's a chance the team unlocks a new level on both ends of the court, and that should keep them in a solid position to compete for a playoff spot. However, there's no guarantee they'll actually get there. The Western Conference remains as competitive as ever, if not more. Currently, every team playing outside of Minnesota has a chance to make it to the playoffs, either by finishing with a top 6 seed or by taking part in the play-in tournament. However, among those 14 teams, only 3 seem to be on a different tier: the Lakers, the Clippers, and the Jazz. That means everyone not named Timberwolves could have a chance to make the playoffs this year, but it also means it will be even more difficult to get over the competition to get there. That could make things harder for the Grizzlies. We already saw how bad they played when the pressure grew up inside the bubble, so if it comes to a few games near the end of the season, their lack of experience could end up costing them a postseason appearance once again. But even if that ends up happening, we can be sure about something. It won't be long before this team starts making some noise. All they need is health and time. But the talent, discipline, and confidence, they're already there. All in all, Memphis may end up going through one of the fastest rebuilds in recent years, and that's worthy of some recognition. After all, it wasn't that long ago when they couldn't consistently make it to the playoffs. But now there's a chance they get back there this season. And even if they don't, there are no doubts this team has what it takes to compete against anyone. They have some special players, and seemingly they also have a special coach. So once they figure things out, they could also become a special team. But now, what are your expectations for the Grizzlies this season? Do you believe they'll make up for their shortcomings inside the bubble? Let us know in the comments. Say, we hope you've enjoyed today's video, and if you did, remember to like it and subscribe to our channel for more NBA content. We are Courtside.